I grew up in a relatively small town just outside the suburbs of Chicago. The neighborhood was pretty nice, and I often look back on those times fondly. Sometimes I drive through the neighborhood for a little nostalgic trip when I'm feeling down, and it never ceases to bring me joy whenever I see a little kid running along the same sidewalk I used to scooter down. One of the things me and my buddies loved doing during those tranquil times of our lives was walking to the nearby convenience store to load up on snacks. It was little ways from our house, though, so our parents weren't too keen on us going. We would often do it anyway, for the hell of it. Strangely, we never got caught. Some of my fondest memories with my buddies happen outside that very store. Recently, however, the store closed down due to lack of customers. It made sense, seeing as how the neighborhood itself was starting to lower in popularity. The store had also only ever been run by one man, Mr. Eisen. Mr. Eisen was a jolly old man. He treated all his customers with respect, and he sometimes got away with giving us free snacks and drinks when business was good and he could afford to do so. It broke my heart to learn that he also recently passed away, which made the closing of the store all that more depressing. Not long after the store's closure, one of the more daring members of my friend group, who we will call John, called me. John was a big horror guy. He loved watching documentaries and TV shows about stuff like ghost hunting or playing really old horror games. He wanted to do a late night camping trip at the store the following night. The building itself hadn't been rented out or gutted by this point. At first, I was hesitant, seeing as how I'm not exactly the type to break into restricted areas, but alas, John convinced me, and he prepared a list of things I might need: food, water, sleeping bags, the usual. Luckily, one of my coworkers offered to cover my night shift, so I didn't miss any work. But looking back, I wish I had taken that shift. As I packed the following afternoon, I received a text from John asking to bring candles. He'd seen a new type of ghost summoning ritual, and he wanted to try it, but he didn't have any candles. I agreed, but only because I didn't really believe in any of those ghost balunga. I didn't expect anything to come of it, so I packed a couple wax candles in some plastic bags and headed over. I arrived at an abandoned store at about 9 p.m., just after most of the cars had gone off the road. John was already inside, and he motioned me in. As I looked around, I got a weird shudder. I assumed that being in the store while it looked like this was kind of a liminal experience. The memories definitely came flooding back, but it made me uneasy rather than nostalgic. John eventually turned to me and asked me for my candles. I reached into the bag and handed them to him, to which he promptly placed them in the triangle shape and lit them one by one. He then turned to me and handed me some kind of monitoring device and told me to tell him if it starts beeping. So I did, and I watched. He began circling the triangle in salt from the bag, then said some kind of gibberish in another language. I wonder if he knows if he looks like an idiot right now, I wondered. Suddenly, the monitor started to beep. I looked over to John and I told him it was beeping, but he didn't move a muscle. He just froze. Not a single peep out of him. I figured he didn't hear me, so I went and shook his shoulder. "Hey," I said, "it's beeping, dude." No movement. I went around to look at his face. He was stuck in a ghost cold expression of fear, like he had seen some heinous crime being committed right in front of him. Suddenly, the lights of the store flickered on, and John fell to the floor. Catching him in midair, I attempted to shake him awake, but he was out cold. Literally, his skin was ice cold, almost like he was dead, but his chest was still moving up and down. I laid him on the ground and pulled out a hunting knife I had brought. I had originally brought it to carve something into the wall to leave a final mark on this place, but unfortunately, it was now a self-defense weapon. Walking over to the breaker, I noticed that the master switch was off, I didn't know if there was a second breaker or not, or if the store was somehow getting power from the second backup generator, but regardless, I flipped it on. This promptly turned the lights off, and I kept it that way so to avoid the police showing up to fully lit, abandoned store with two random teenagers in it. I went and I picked up John's things, and then picked up John. I was about to walk out of the store when I heard a click from the back. Dropping John, I pulled out my knife and yelled into pitch black. "Who's there?" I yelled, receiving no response. At this point, I was genuinely creeped out. I stowed my knife and picked up John and went to push the door open. The door was locked. From the outside. "Oh, damn you," I complained to no one. Looking around, I spotted an emergency crowbar in the glass case labeled "Emergencies Only" in bright red text. Breaking the glass, I picked it up and attempted to break out one of the windows. I swung as hard as I could, but the glass would not break. We were stuck inside. I thought about calling the police, but I didn't want to have to explain to them why we were there, so I decided against it. I placed a crowbar on the ground along with John and sat down next to the door. After about 5 minutes, John woke up in a panic. "We need to get out of here now," he screamed, pushing the door. When he eventually looked down and saw me not helping him, I assumed he'd realize the door was not going to move. "What's the rush, Mr. Brave and Bold?" I scoffed. "Too scared of a little dark?" "You don't understand," he said. "If we don't get out of this, he's going to—" Suddenly, a loud crash came from the back of the store. I grabbed the crowbar and handed it to John. "Freeman it up, wise guy. You have the point." He gulped, and we both walked towards the sound. As we walked by, I noticed some of the items in the store had been moved. Cups were in the toy aisle. Notebooks were in the refrigerators. It was a very strange detail, considering I don't remember when they had moved. Suddenly, John screamed and dropped the crowbar, darting for the door. I turned towards him, then towards where he'd been looking, and I realized why he'd run. Standing there was a tall figure, with wide eyes and a wide smile. It was a man, but his presence was so unnatural. He didn't seem real. All of a sudden, the man charged at me full speed and grabbed a hold of my arm. I managed to fight myself free of his grip and ran. I ran after John, trying to keep up. Luckily, the force of John slamming into the window seemed to finally bust it. He rode out into the parking lot. I followed suit, and as we both got into my car, the man began sprinting towards us, a loud, ear-piercing screech along with it. The second my car started, I floored the gas and swerved out of the parking lot into the street. We didn't care if the cops caught us anymore. We just needed to run. We drove at top speed for about 20 minutes before pulling to a curb. I slumped back into my seat, and John did the same. "What the hell was that, John?" I screamed. "You could have had us killed." He turned to look at me, and then started to cry. "Damn, man," he said, slumping further into his chair. I sat up straight and sighed, staring at the road. I made several sharp turns and eventually got onto the highway. It was then I realized that John had passed out, and I started towards the nearest emergency room. It's been about 2 weeks since that night. The police never caught us, and John ended up having severe memory loss of the whole event. He's back to his old self now, but something about that neighborhood makes me never want to go back to it at night. I'm never camping again. I sat by the fire and exhaled slowly before taking in the cool night air. The fire danced and crackled along to its natural rhythm, and the hidden army of crickets soon took up their famous chirp. This time used to be my favorite part of camping, just immersing myself in the calm solitude these mountains never failed to provide, while watching dusk fade to night was always a perfect way to end a long day spent in the woods. I was deep in thought when something pulled me quite violently out of my thoughts and filled me with dread. I felt like I was being watched. The crickets had stopped and been replaced by a low, almost musical humming that seemed to come from all around my camp, just outside the firelight. I peer into the inky abyss between the trees illuminated by my fire, attempting in vain to find the source of the noise. I have a history of occasionally auditory hallucinations, usually before and after sleep, so I chalked it up to exhaustion and decided to turn it in for the night. After kicking out my fire, which was already burning low, the humming seemed to slowly get louder and closer, but I still thought it was only a hallucination at the time, so I ignored it and continued over to my tent. By the time I was zipped up in my sleeping bag, the humming was nearly deafening, so I sat curled up in the fetal position at the bottom of the sleeping bag, with my hands clutched over my ears. The noise was still growing closer, to the point where I felt it more than I heard it. The sound of a freight train thundering all around my camp, vibrating the very earth I was laying on. It got closer and closer, louder than I thought possible. And just when I thought surely my eardrums would give out from the pressure and I would be deaf, it stopped. At this point, I was too shaken to move or really do anything. No way I could make it to my car, so I sat there shaking and crying, eventually drifting off to sleep. When I woke up, the events of the night before were completely off my mind. I lazily started a fire to make breakfast and coffee, and it wasn't until the coffee was halfway brewed and I was absent-mindedly staring into the open flame that the trauma I'd experienced from the night before slowly started seeping its way back into my thoughts. I sat down next to the fire and contemplated the events of the night before. No hallucination I'd ever experienced has ever been louder than a normal speaking voice, and perhaps more importantly, I felt the ground shake with my whole body. My hallucinations have never been more than auditory. I knew logically that it couldn't be a simple hallucination, but at the time I was a strict skeptic, and another explanation eluded me, so I decided to continue my camping trip. Not only that, but I already took time off work and wouldn't get another chance to come out here for a while, so I desperately didn't want to shorten my already limited time camping. After deciding to ignore the events of the night before, I enjoyed my camping trip like any other. I hiked, fished, and even went for a very cold swim in the lake nearby. My trauma, almost entirely forgotten in the light of day, was easy to ignore, without any physical evidence or lasting damage. By the time I made my way back, the shadows had grown long and the sunlight had grown orange, so I immediately started getting a fire going, when a familiar dread crept its way back into my psyche, with its accompanying hum. I quickly turned away from my unfinished campfire to scan the tree line for an unseen observer, and caught movement in the corner of my eye. But naturally, by the time my head snapped over, there was nothing to see but trees and fading sunlight, and the faint sound of humming. Cold terror shot down my spine, and voices that didn't feel like mine filled my head with the words, "Go away," in a panicked voice. I may have had a history of hallucinations, but this was simply too much. I was going home. I started taking down my tent, hoping to get it cleaned up before the sun left me alone in the dark. But the feeling of dread was growing worse, and the sun was fading faster than I thought it would. I was still struggling to fit everything in the bag with shaking hands when I looked up to watch the last holdouts of the sunset fall beneath the horizon, and felt a much worse sense of dread settle deep within me. I saw a tall figure creeping towards me through the trees in the post-sunset light, pale and upright, but too far away to make out the details beyond that. The humming noise grew with the approach of the mysterious creature, causing me to freeze in place for a couple of seconds before grabbing my keys and bolting to my car, but not before noticing the thing take off towards me as soon as I moved for my keys. I was enveloped by the ever-present humming that terrified me the night before, but in the moment it only felt comforting, like an old friend who had my back. I pulled open the door to my car and felt something sharp graze my shoulder as I slid and slammed the door. I looked out my window, and the thing was running full tilt in my car, but only moving backward. Something was only keeping it at bay, but actually pushing back this white thing that so threatened my life and so injured my shoulder. The buzzing was as loud as it had ever been before, and the space in front of the creature was blurry, obstructing my view. But I had no time to contemplate the implications of these facts. I yanked my car into drive and broke every speed limit on the way home. I still don't know what that thing was, but I'm thankful for whatever made that buzzing noise. I think it saved my life. I'm also not too broken up about leaving my camping supplies behind. I'm sticking to the city from now on. I went camping out at Trinity Lakes this October in Idaho. My brother and his mom's family told me how great it was out there. I figured if we did it on a weekday, that late into this year, we could be alone. Truly be out on the nature experience after doing nothing but staying in the city for the past few years. What I was not told was that the road out there was a 2-hour crawl through dirt roads, the final 10 miles of which are practically animal trails on the edge of the mountains. It is a very rough trip in a big old F-250. Red flag number one in hindsight. By the time the roads got that bad, we were so far in I was committed. We would do this, and it would be a unique experience for both of us. God, I eat those words. When we finally made to the first campground area on the smallest lake, we just wanted to get out of the truck and couldn't take much more of the bone-shaking rock crawling. So we did just that, meaning we were in a different spot than where him and the other side of the family had camped farther up the big lake. Everything with the setup was standard, and we had gotten what we wanted. We were completely alone. Only the fire watch tower 2 miles back, and over a mountain if anything went wrong. This should have been a red flag number 2, but we figured we had enough gear and knowledge if a bear or cougar came along. Another important thing was that the rules of the area sang no guns, so we didn't bring one, not even as a last resort kind of tool. Red flag number 3. Not 1 hour after setting out camp all the way, I hear a snap-off on the other side of an empty campground while me and him are talking. He doesn't seem to notice, but I look back and I see 2 giant antlers. I knew immediately what it was. I rushed him quietly into the truck, and a big bull moose sprints into view behind the truck. We did not know there were moose out there, and they had not seen any when they camped at the main lake grounds earlier in the year. We were not that scared because he ran off immediately after we got some footage of him by the lake. We decided it was a rare encounter, and were kind of in awe at the experience. I knew how crazy dangerous moose are, but never bothered searching the details on their behavior or anything like that. Big mistake not immediately packing everything and getting out what we still could, and while we had enough daylight. We hop out of the truck, make sure he's long gone, and continue on our now much cooler nature trip, relaxing and taking photos. Almost 3 hours later, I hear that same kind of cracking, but a lot more of it, and approaching our campsite quickly. We are not close enough to the truck with how fast it's coming, so I pull my brother into the tent and just stay perfectly still. I didn't even want to breathe, as 5 or more moose, with 2 bulls that seemed to be chasing each other around, sprinted past our campsite on both sides. We could only see out of the front flap of the tent and determine whereabouts outside of that from the footsteps and what I assume were mating calls. This time, we were not so excited about it. Nearly crapping brakes and just praying when we got out of the tent that there would not be a lurking moose that hadn't gone with the rest of them. There wasn't, but now there was not enough light left to pack everything up and get out safely. We no longer felt safe and were constantly on edge, knowing at any moment we may need to get to the truck and have to be aware. The plan was to pack up as soon as morning broke, and we just had to make it till then. When night came, we were actually relaxed again, thinking that with a fire up and it being night, surely we were done with any possible moose in the area. We just wanted to eat and smoke our cigars around the campfire. We had our campfire going, ate our food, and had our cigars ready. However, we needed a bit more firewood to last for our smoke before bed. So we made a small trip. It was pitch black in that forest, even with our eyes adjusted. The second we got away from the camp to the area where we'd been gathering from, me and him were both on edge again. We got that feeling like something was watching us, just on the edge of that light from our phone. So we hurried up, scurried back to the campsite like you just turned off your steer's light, and breathed a sigh of relief. The fire was safe, nothing was out there, everything was fine. Then, the bone-chilling crunch of one of the thick branches we had dropped in our hurry, just on the edge of the firelight, directly behind us. Every single instinct and reactionary fiber of my being activated right then. The only word I plainly and coarsely told my brother was, car. I already made strides towards my truck, my brother told me after the fact. The way that word left your mouth took me into freeze mode. It was the most direct, fear-induced command I've ever received. To both of our horror, the truck had auto-locked. The 1 or 2 seconds it took me to fumble the keys out of my tight Wrangler pockets and hit that button felt like hell. We jumped in the truck, and I scrambled over him as he slammed the door, flinging the headlights on. Right there, right in front of the fire we had just been standing at, a bull, staring the truck down. But the part that makes this all so much more screwed up, he didn't look like a normal moose. The fur was all patchy, and it looked discolored, like he was rotting on the outside, but still easily taller than the lifted truck. I watched him slowly walk out of the headlights back into the darkness while staring at us. I turned off the lights immediately so our eyes could adjust, and we could see around the truck at least. We were freaking out and filled with adrenaline, still but doing so quietly. Neither him or I could agree on these next occurrences, were just as shape paranoia or not. For nearly an hour at 10 p.m. at night, we heard heavy footsteps just slowly moving big circles around the truck. Eventually, we stopped hearing anything at all, and the forest was completely silent. We cracked the windows to make sure. Deafening silence. No bugs, no frogs, no owls, nothing. We sat there an additional 30 minutes, listening for anything at all, but still silence. Neither of us wanted to do it, but all our warm gear was in that tent, and it was dropping to 28 that night. We would not fare well in just our normal clothes, so slowly we opened the doors and started to sneak to the tent. The moment we did, footsteps on my side of the forest coming towards us. Both of us fly back in the truck, clicking the lock button like maniacs. I couldn't take it anymore. I nearly lost my cool, but I knew I had to keep it for my brother's sake, too. It was stalking us. Is it even a damn moose? Moose don't do this. It's almost midnight. What the hell is happening? We kept throwing these statements around to each other, trying to rationalize what we were experiencing and how our nice escape from the city had turned to a horror movie. With the unnatural look of the moose that we thought had been keeping us trapped in the truck for an hour and a half, we stared, talking about its skin. We started talking about it being a skinwalker even. Some might think this would freak us out more, but starting to make things a supernatural event and joking in our dark sense of humor is what helped us calm down. We were still shaking to our core though, and the fear was stronger than the bite of the cold that was setting in. No way in hell we were leaving the truck again until it was morning, and we could see. He managed to fall asleep around 12:30, but the forest was still dead, silent, and it put a dread in me. It wasn't until nearly 2 that all of a sudden, crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. The normal forest sounds came back, and I'd stayed up until the temperature reached its bottom for the night. I turned the heater on full blast for a few minutes to stop the unbearable chill, so I could sleep, waking up and repeating that every 45 minutes to keep us warm until morning. Then, I opened my eyes to the light and shook him awake. We packed in 15 minutes and left. Nothing has struck such primal fear in me ever. I've had guns pointed at me, other dangerous encounters with animals. None of those compare to the terror this incident caused. I fear going into the woods at all, or going camping again.